needed to talk to witnesses, but Heathlands refused Billy to talk to anyone.
The record notes your instructions that I must not communicate with employees of the Federation of Jewish Services. In order to clarify certain issues, it will be necessary to interview a number of witnesses involved in this matter. When Janette entered that courtroom, she had no witnesses, not even a basic written statement to verify her version of events. The Federation, already refusing me access to witnesses involved with the internal investigation, were now to refuse to disclose the documentation. Joanne Ingber, the HR officer, was to state the following: due to confidentiality and data protection, we are unable to provide the requested documents.
We was always told that key workers input were always used in investigations and in legal procedures.
The excuse Joanne Ingber had given me to justify her refusal was incorrect. On the very day the witness statements were to be exchanged, the Federation instead decided, for whatever reason and so late in the day, to place the case into the hands of legal representatives. I then received a request from their legal representatives for a postponement of the exchange of witness statements for another 2 weeks. They had decided that none of the managers involved with the internal investigation were to give evidence nor be available for cross-examination. Despite all these setbacks, I was able to establish that Karen Johnson hadn't followed ACAS code recommendations regarding disciplinary procedures. Karen Johnson arbitrarily gave Janette specific written instructions to come in 30 minutes before her disciplinary to peruse the documentation. Already struggling with writing and articulation problems, Janette was expected to study numerous anonymous witness statements, analyse the complex minutes of an investigation meeting and prepare a defence, all in 30 minutes. In fact, Karen Johnson was to admit on the stand that she was not familiar with the ACAS code.
They asked me if I read all the documents. I said yeah, but I didn't understand. There was lots of papers, all the names were Tipexed out.
Even Janette's desperate plea during that meeting that she did not know what was going on because she didn't know who had accused her went unheard, not only by the Federation but also by her union representative.
I am staying positive, but it's hard. The things I'm doing at the moment is doing my photography, which I love, and also playing the guitar.
The Federation of Jewish Services received a letter from a Mr. Martin Ighodaro. It contained a number of serious allegations against a number of his co-workers, including Janette. Now, Janette never received a copy of this letter, and this fact was to play a major part in the internal investigation. This matter will also serve as a clear example of the difficulties I had of getting to the truth when dealing with the Federation of Jewish Services.
She told the tribunal that she gave me the letter, but that wasn't true. I never saw the letter. They said they gave it to me and I knew everything that was in it, but I didn't know anything about it.
Janette was completely unaware that she was just one of at least 5 members of staff Mr. Ighodaro had brought allegations against, and this fact was never disputed throughout all correspondence with the Federation of Jewish Services until shortly before the tribunal hearing, and I'll tell you why. Rumours started to filter down to me from Federation employees that the accused members of staff had been treated in different ways. In fact, we were to discover that some of the allegations were not investigated at all, despite the Federation testifying otherwise. The Federation at the time refused to disclose relevant documents on these matters, so in order to secure these documents, I applied to the Tribunal for an amendment of the claim to include unequal treatment. This was made on the legitimate grounds that Janette was unaware of the multiple allegations at the time of the initial claim. The Federation were now to flatly deny that they withheld this information and set about trying to persuade the Tribunal that they had given Janette a copy of that letter, and they were to be very adamant on this matter. As your client should be aware, our client provided a copy of Mr. Ighodaro's grievance letter to the claimant at the commencement of the disciplinary hearing. Karen Johnson, the clinical manager at the time for the Federation, was also to add her authority to this claim. She was to categorically testify under oath that Janette had been handed a copy of that letter at the disciplinary meeting that she herself had conducted. Ms. Ingber handed the following to the claimant, Mr. Ighodaro's grievance letter.
They knew very well that they never gave me the letter and I never saw it. I thought it was just me that Martin had accused and I was all on my own.
Janette's denial against all this impressive testimony looked very tame indeed. However, in their eagerness to persuade the Tribunal that their version of events was the correct one, they hadn't done their homework, and the Federation had carelessly overlooked a vital piece of documentation. Joanne Ingber, the investigation manager, the very person who handed the documents to Janette, had already confirmed to the Tribunal in writing that Janette had not been given a copy of that original grievance letter. Now, despite these managers not even agreeing on crucial facts between themselves, they were also claiming that the letter had been read out loud to Janette. Now, although the managers quoted from that letter, it is clear by the way the accusations were worded to Janette that it had not been read out in its entirety as they were implying, and as will be revealed as we examine the internal investigation in detail. So where did this leave Karen Johnson? Confronted with this evidence, she was now obliged to withdraw the false statement. Despite swearing to the contrary, she in fact had no idea at all whether Janette had received a copy of that letter. And we can be sure that this statement was made without an honest belief in its truth. We know this because she even went on to describe Janette's copy of this letter, which did not exist, by again categorically stating that Mr. Ighodaro's name had not been concealed from it. Mr. Ighodaro's identity was not concealed in the copy of the letter passed to Janette at this hearing. Now that the truth about this letter had been settled, we need to ask a very important question. Why would management give copies of everything to Janette, minutes of the meetings, the anonymous witnesses, everything, except that original letter of allegations? Well, this letter was the only document which contained any references to any of the other allegations Mr. Ighodaro had brought against the other members of staff. It was also the only document which identified Mr. Ighodaro as the originator of the allegations. In fact, this letter contained everything that the Federation insisted that Janette knew about, even if it did mean them making a false claim in a sworn witness statement. Management declared most of the witnesses against Janette as anonymous, without any valid moral nor legal reasons, making it impossible for Janette to challenge her accusers. And even where there are valid reasons, management are obliged by case law to conduct discreet background checks to ensure that there are no personal grudges and to ensure the credibility of such accusers. The Federation of Jurist Services failed in these responsibilities. In fact, the information which was to surface concerning Mr. Ighodaro and his conduct and attitude in the workplace was instead suppressed during Janette's investigation. In this continuing quest to clear Janette's name, I would now like to present this information to you. This information comes from documents the Federation were reluctant to disclose, claiming that it was irrelevant and even accusing me of inappropriately fishing for information. Janette was obliged to officially report matters of the joint incompetence towards residents of Mr. Ighodaro and his friend, Mr. X. She was then to discover that allegations had been brought against her by Mr. Ighodaro and his friend, Mr. X. Management also knew of a second female member of staff who had also been obliged to officially report Mr. Ighodaro's incompetence regarding residents. She was also to have allegations brought against her by Mr. Ighodaro. Management were also aware of a third female member of staff who was to document a catalogue of the most serious issues she was having with Mr. Iguodara's unacceptable behaviour and attitude on the unit. This person was also to have allegations brought against her by Mr. Iguodara. The record showed that Mr. Iguodara brought allegations against all the members of staff who had been unfortunate enough to cross his path. In the few short months of employment, Mr. Iguodara had amassed a long list of issues against himself. The following information is from witness statements collected by the investigation team themselves and from documents that were fully at their disposal. Was slow and incompetent. Was argumentative, inability to carry out instructions, failed to carry out instructions, was told to do one thing and he'd do another, couldn't communicate with him because he wouldn't listen, staff found it difficult to work with him, was disobedient to instructions, was insubordinate to a senior member of staff, argued in front of residents, left residents soaked in urine and feces to go on his break. Nothing registered with him. Didn't seem to grasp anything. It was known to the managers that Mr. Iguodara had claimed to at least one member of staff that he suffered from an obsessive-compulsive disorder. He used to tell me about his disease, OCD. He liked things very neat and tidy. He also made this claim to Janette and to at least one other member of staff I've since spoken to. But there is no evidence of any investigation into how this alleged disorder might have affected his judgment when criticising the actions of other members of staff. Mr. Iguodara had described in his original letter the most horrendous first week of hell working with Janette, which resulted in him bringing numerous unwitnessed allegations against Janette and, of course, against the other members of staff who had previously had cause to report his behaviour and attitude. And yet, under interview, he was to state that when his friends had asked him about his first week working with Janette, he said it went okay. This extraordinary and vital contradiction was discovered in the documents that they did not wish me to have sight of. Every statement that Janette made in her defence regarding Mr. Iguodara's attitude and behaviour in the workplace was already confirmed by the documentation in the possession of the managers, but it was never to be referred to again. In fact, they were to portray Mr. Iguodara as a credible witness throughout Janette's investigation. And this maintaining of his credibility was not to end there. At the tribunal, the Federation of Jewish Services knowingly quoted Mr. Iguodara's untrue statement that there were no further issues between him and another member of staff he had brought allegations against. Mr. Iguodara said himself that he experienced no other problems in the past with Sister X and that what happened on that day was a one-off. They made this sworn statement in the full knowledge that they possessed documentation listing a catalogue of further issues between them, including an allegation of the abuse of a female resident. Mr. Iguodara had taken an elderly female resident into the toilets on his own for 15 minutes after being expressly told not to do so. The documents further allege that this poor woman was so distressed by Mr. Iguodara's actions that it took them half an hour to calm her down in order to prevent her from bringing a complaint against Heathlands Care Home. The important point here is that the investigation team knew from the documents in their possession that Mr. Iguodara had not been telling the truth, but they were still to maintain his credibility. Joanne Ingber, Janette's investigation manager, stated at the strategy meeting with the adult safeguarding team that there had never been any complaints about Martin Iguodara. At the follow-up strategy meeting, when the Federation were undoubtedly fully aware of all the complaints and serious allegations against Mr. Iguodara, this untrue statement, according to the minutes, had not been corrected by Joanne Ingber, nor by Karen Johnson, the disciplinary officer, who, according to the minutes, was also present at this second meeting. During my own investigations, I inquired whether these allegations had been reported to the proper authorities as required, and whether this untrue information had since been corrected in these official records. My recorded delivery letter was treated with total contempt by the Federation of Jewish Services. This then was the well-documented evidence the management were aware of concerning Mr. Ighodaro's behaviour and attitude in the workplace. Everything from personal vendettas, insubordination to the abuse of a female resident. With all this information suppressed, they were now to present Mr. Ighodaro as a reliable, credible witness. And then, by leading Janette into believing that she was the only person accused, they were now to commence what they were to call a thorough investigation. An allegation of racism is a very serious matter. It places a great responsibility upon an investigation team to establish the facts as carefully and as thoroughly as possible. They should also ensure that the accused person is presented with the clearest and fullest details of the accusation and be given every opportunity to respond to it. The investigation team, instead of dealing with the numerous anonymous allegations individually, decided to throw two racist allegations at Janette at the same time, and then completely overwhelmed her by throwing in other anonymous allegations, claiming that they somehow corroborated the original allegation. Now that we've had an opportunity to examine all the documentation, what we need to do here is to untangle all of these numerous anonymous allegations and deal with them one by one in order to get to the truth of each. Indeed, as the managers should have done during the investigation and disciplinary procedures. The Federation claimed to Janette that they had 3 anonymous witnesses saying that statements stipulated that she'd bullied and made racist remarks against a third party, who for the purposes of this investigation we shall refer to as Mr. X. 3 witnesses have told us while we carried out an investigation that Mr. X was bullied by you. Statements stipulate Janette treats him like an idiot, and the majority of new staff too. Shit Filipino doesn't understand. You do not understand English, so why the shit did you come here? Did they tell you who these 3 witnesses were?
No.
Did they tell you where these things happened, when they happened, who else might have been there, what the circumstances were?
No.
Other than the allegation itself, they gave Janette no details whatsoever. All Janette could do was deny or admit, a position that case law states that no employee should ever be placed into.
I kept telling them that I didn't say it, but they wouldn't listen, and that they had witnesses, but I didn't know who they were.
Ignoring her denials and relying on anonymous witnesses that Janette was unable to challenge, they repeatedly put the allegation to her. Janette, frightened and anxious and engulfed with numerous other anonymous allegations, was eventually to say something that was to incriminate her. The word probably.
I thought if I kept denying it, they was just saying I was lying and sacked me. And I didn't want to say yes because I know I didn't say it. When I said I didn't do it, they just ignored me and kept asking me again and again. I didn't know what to say, so I just said probably.
Just let me get this. So you said probably because, as we can see in the documents, they wouldn't accept your denials, and they claimed that anonymous witness statements stipulated that you'd made racist remarks against this third party.
Yes.
The investigation team's claims to Janette that they had 3 anonymous witnesses, statements stipulating that Janette had bullied and made racist remarks to a third party, were not true. There were no statements at all from any witnesses alleging that Janette had made racist remarks to a third party, Mr. X. The investigation team also withheld from Janette that Mr. X was not, in fact, this innocent third party, but the one and only one who had actually made any allegation. And this one and only accuser, Mr. X, had not made any references at all to witnesses, let alone 3 of them. In the case Salford Royal NHS Foundation Trust versus Roldan, the Court of Appeal concluded, where there's conflicting and unproven evidence from 2 employees, the safest option is to conclude that there is, in fact, no case to answer. Management decided to bundle 2 other anonymous statements of alleged bullying, which we shall unmask in a moment, together with Mr. X's sole allegation of racism, and misrepresented them to Janette as a bundle of 3 anonymous witnesses alleging bullying and racism against a third party. If they told you the truth, that there were in fact no witnesses and that it was just himself who'd made the allegation, would you have answered in the same way?
No, because if I knew it was who said it, then I would have told them what was going on in the unit.
They said that they had anonymous witnesses that I bullied definite workers, but it's not true. I was so upset inside that I wanted to cry. Joanne Ingberg never spoke to any definite workers that I'd known for 13 years. The only one they named was Martin's friend, but it wasn't about bullying. He kept feeling me, touching my bottom and my waist, not just me, but also another female member of staff. I had told him to stop, but he wouldn't. Every time I was nice to him, he would do it again. They just said I was bullying him, but I was trying to keep him away from me. Another member of staff also knew about it. She asked me what was going on when she heard me telling him not to touch me. Management never asked her anything about what was really going on. Management hadn't told me at the time that it was him and Martin who said I was bullying him. I knew he was married and I didn't want to get him into trouble. If I'd known it was him, then I would have told them what was really going on.
The more serious an allegation, the more rigorous and thorough that investigation should be. And yet there is absolutely no evidence of any investigation into this serious allegation of racism. The Federation's claimed thorough investigation into this matter consisted solely of putting an anonymous allegation to Janette, misleading her about her true accuser, and leading her to believe that there were 3 anonymous witnesses involved in this matter. By refusing her repeated denials and persistently putting the allegation to her, Janette was eventually to say the word probably to escape the impossible situation that they had placed her in. They then took this answer, extracted from a false scenario, and applied it to the real scenario as a confession. Karen Johnson was also to testify that she did not consider that Mr. X had any ulterior motives to make an allegation. The 2 important facts missing from her statement were that she had absolutely no basis for her personal opinion, as there'd been no investigation, and that Janette's confession had been extracted by presenting her with a false scenario. However, there were documented issues Karen Johnson failed to consider regarding ulterior motives. First, Mr. X was a friend of Janette's original accuser, Mr. Ighodaro. As a member of staff put it to me, they would work together on the unit at every opportunity. There was also some concern of these 2 males working together with female residents, which would have been confirmed by members of staff if a proper investigation had been conducted. Second, further withheld documents reveal that Janette and another member of staff were obliged to officially report matters of Mr. X's and Mr. Ighodaro's joint incompetence regarding the treatment and distress of female residents. Third, discovered from documents withheld from Janette's investigation, was an interview with Mr. Ighodaro where he states that he and Mr. X, together with a 3rd member of staff, had had previous discussions about Janette prior to bringing these allegations. And of course we have Janette's rejection of his unwanted physical attentions, a major omission in this investigation. And who were these other 2 anonymous witnesses that Joanne Ingberg had bundled with Mr. X's sole allegation? We discover that they came from Mr. Ighodaro himself and this 3rd person. Bear in mind this connection between Mr. Ighodaro, Mr. X and this 3rd member of staff, as the relevance will become more and more apparent as we start to unmask the anonymous witnesses. Now, because Janette could not articulate her way out of these so-called confessions, even her desperate attempts to mitigate the situation were to be interpreted as further confessions by Karen Johnson at the disciplinary meeting. So after they claimed you'd admitted it, you said that it might have been discrimination, but that it wasn't racism. Did you understand the legal implications of what you were saying?
No, not really.
Karen Johnson, in fact, asked you if you understood the difference, and you said that you didn't.
I told her I didn't understand what I was saying, but by saying it I thought she wouldn't call me racist.
So Karen Johnson, who claimed you'd admitted discrimination, knew all along that you didn't even understand what it properly meant. And what of these other numerous peripheral anonymous witnesses which Joanne Ingberg claimed supported the allegations against Janette? A close analysis reveals extreme bias and misrepresentation. For instance, Joanne Ingber claimed that she carried out an investigation with the staff. Can you explain what's going on, as it is very coincidental that we carry out an investigation asking staff what advice they'd give to a new member of staff about to commence work on Unit 1. Majority of first responses are "watch your back." Unfortunately, this is referring to your behaviour on the floor.
When she said the majority, I thought everyone was against me. I thought, why would my friends say that? All I wanted to do was to go home and not come back to work.
This claim that the majority opinion from an investigation with the staff considered Janette to be a problem in the workplace was probably the most damning accusation made against Janette, particularly as it came from the investigation team themselves and was clearly intended to be supportive of the allegations made against Janette. Let's now look at the documentation. The majority, as emphasised by Joanne Ingber, turns out to be 2 of 3 people she had approached. And who exactly were these people? From the evidence withheld from Janette's investigation, we discover that out of 300 plus staff members, Joanne Ingber decided to approach those specifically pointed out to her by Mr. Ighodaro. People who Joanne Ingber already knew from documentation had met up with Mr. Ighodaro and had been gossiping about Janette. Guaranteed negative statements. This was then to be portrayed to Janette as the majority opinion of some kind of fair and balanced investigation with the staff. They allowed Janette to walk out of that building following her dismissal, believing that the majority of staff were against her. When I started inquiring into these unsubstantiated witness statements, Joanne Ingber was to state that one of these statements was hearsay and had not influenced Janette's dismissal. The question then is, why did Joanne Ingber use it as evidence for her majority staff responses? And why did Karen Johnson refer to it as corroborating evidence of Janette's verbal abuse of residents and falsely claim to Janette that it had been part of an investigation and had been looked into when it clearly hadn't? There was also some serious concern regarding the second of these 2 documents. I've had a statement with regard to another member of staff, and she was thrown verbal abuse from you for apparently no reason. Janette stated that she was honestly unaware of any such incident. Joanne Ingber was to state, however, without any elaboration, that there were witnesses. Janette, not knowing who witnesses were, how many there were, where they came from, was unable to challenge Joanne Ingber's claim. However, the documents do challenge that claim. When the accuser was interviewed, she mentioned nothing about witnesses. I also have verification from the Federation's legal advisors that I have had sight of all the documents in this case. And there are no other references to this incident whatsoever. These anonymous witnesses that Joanne Ingber referred to in order to justify overriding Janette's denial did not exist. There were no witnesses. In fact, when I started to investigate the many discrepancies in these witness statements during legal proceedings, Joanne Ingber was to falsely declare that her witnesses needed safeguarding from me and issued instructions that I must not communicate with any of the witnesses involved with the internal investigation. Another peripheral witness was to single Janette out as the only member of staff on the unit that Mr. Ighodaro had a problem with. Now, as soon as this person started talking, Joanne Ingber knew from the suppressed information that this person had absolutely no idea of what was going on the unit. Joanne Ingber knew that Mr. Ighodaro claimed he had problems with at least 5 other members of the unit. Joanne Ingber also knew that other members of staff had experienced the exact same frustrations dealing with Mr. Ighodaro's disobedience and incompetence as Janette had. She was absolutely no different from the others. In fact, this witness herself had had a lot to say to colleagues about her own frustrations working with Mr. Ighodaro, the very reason that Janette gave her name as one of 3 witnesses to support her. Janette had thought that this person was her friend, but she was now to claim to Joanne Ingber that she had a good relationship with Mr. Ighodaro. Karen Johnson at the disciplinary meeting was to ignore Janette's insistence that this person was not telling the truth, that she was painting a rosy picture. She never considered for one moment to call a number of witnesses who could have corroborated what Janette was saying. Instead, with all the other documents of related issues suppressed and withheld from Janette, this was portrayed to her as though it were a single, one-off, isolated incident, unconnected with anything else, and was used as evidence of Janette's bullying of Mr. Ighodaro. And what of the credibility of this particular witness? We have her boasting in front of a video camera of her assistance in the attempted theft and damage to Federation fixtures.
I'll get up for the chair. She's unscrewed it, it's all electric, right? The things have gone on in there.
We also have her boasting of the inappropriate way she speaks to the residents' relatives. We even have her having a lot to say about management themselves. Some of these clips have been posted on the internet in support of the Justice For Janette campaign. And even though I disguised her voice, members of staff still recognise her characteristic gossiping tones. The credibility of witnesses and their statements was of very little concern to the investigation manager. The only criterion appeared to be anything hearsay gossip as long as it was negative about Janette. And this unsubstantiated personal rant fitted the bill perfectly. Janette's second witness confirmed her statements of the frustrations of dealing with Mr. Ighodaro's incompetence and disobedience. This was never to be referred to. The third of Janette's supporting witnesses, well, the management didn't even bother questioning her. Another very impressive bundle of anonymous witnesses was to be presented to Janette. It has been alleged by 6 members of staff that you are in a mood often, and therefore staff feel as if they have to walk on eggshells, as they are nervous and feel intimidated by the way you speak to them. Again, without names, times, dates, places, Janette was completely unable to respond to these allegations. All she could say is that she didn't know. Sometimes she was in a bad mood, but not all the time. Joanne Ingber emphasised that it was 6 different employees giving 6 statements. Joanne Ingber again left out the fact that they were composed of Mr. Ighodaro and those he had specifically directed Joanne Ingber to. In their quest for negative-only information, the investigation team ignored a very important remark made about Janette by one of these anonymous accusers, and that is that she was crying a lot in the workplace. The pro bono professional HR officer who is assisting us with this investigation considered that the management's failure to investigate such an important statement, which clearly indicated that something was very wrong, was a major omission in this career-destroying investigation. She also reminded us that the ACAS code states that investigations should be conducted into the domestic background of accused persons if it might help to explain certain behaviours in the workplace. Check if there are any special circumstances to be taken into account. For example, are there personal or other outside issues affecting performance or conduct? But the fact that an employee of the Federation of Jewish Services was crying a lot in the workplace was to be of no concern to the HR officer conducting this particular investigation.
They said anonymous witnesses said I was in the mood and everybody had to tread on eggshells. Afterwards I thought it was at the time when there was a lot going on in my life. I'd just been to the funeral of my nan and was very upset when she died. At the time my mum and I were suffering long-term harassment by thugs on our estate who was vandalising our property and my car. We had to go to court about it and it was very upsetting. My mother also went into hospital with kidney problems and I was worried sick about her. I remember crying a lot at work because of all the stress. My friends at work knew about these things and supported me. We found out afterwards that one of the witnesses had stated that I was crying a lot. Management never asked them, my friends or me, about any of these things. They just made it sound like I was evil and bad.
Without the slightest intentions of carrying out any investigations, these statements concerning Janette's moodiness and crying a lot in the workplace were instead used as corroborating evidence of Janette's intimidation and bullying of the staff. Even one of the unit managers considered that Janette's moodiness did not unduly affect her work with the residents, nor her interaction with the staff. Do you believe that staff are intimidated by Janette's behaviour? No. Does this have an impact on residents? No, she may just be quieter. This fair and balanced statement from one of the most credible witnesses at the Federation, who had worked with Janette for the best part of 10 years, was also not to be referred to at the disciplinary meeting. There were no statements, of course, from any of Janette's friends and colleagues who were supporting her through this difficult time, witnesses who would have provided the investigation team with a balanced picture of what was going on, witnesses who could have helped them establish the facts. The collecting of negative-only witness statements in order to support allegations is apparently very common in internal investigations. It's the old devil or angel trick. Collect information only to make somebody appear a devil, or collect information only to make them appear an angel. And this is very evident from the management's priority to question those pointed out to them by Mr. Ighodaro himself. And this is the reason the ACAS Code advises on such matters. It is important to keep an open mind and look for evidence which supports the employee's case as well as evidence against. The ACAS Code played no part in this investigation, and it was to be of no concern whatsoever to Karen Johnson, a disciplinary officer appointed by the Federation of Jewish Services, who was to state under cross-examination that she wasn't even familiar with the ACAS Code. Mr. Ighodaro in fact stated that there were no witnesses to his allegations, except 2 senior members of staff who he claimed witnessed the alleged bullying of Mr. X. I have never had sight of any statements from these 2 senior members of staff. The Federation ignored all repeated requests to have them identified so that they could be questioned. The Federation would not allow me to investigate Mr. Ighodaro's claim during legal proceedings. This allegation has been quoted twice by 2 individual witnesses, and therefore this allegation has been upheld. The investigation team apparently struck lucky. They claimed they had found 2 independent witnesses who had made exactly the same allegation against Janette. That she had been verbally abusive to residents, saying, "Do it yourself, we're not your slaves." These 2 independent witnesses had also claimed that Janette had said that the residents treat us like slaves. Joanne Ingber had stressed to Janette that these were different witnesses who had said exactly the same things. She emphasised further, "It's a slight coincidence, isn't it?" And even further, "I haven't put these words into their mouths." It appeared to be a mystery to Joanne Ingber, the investigation manager. It was also to be a mystery to Karen Johnson, the disciplinary officer, who parroted Joanne Ingber by stating that these were 2 witness statements from 2 different people, and emphasised further 2 different people saying the same things. Karen Johnson was even to put the question to Janette, why would 2 people say the opposite to you? With no details, times, places, Janette gave the only answer possible. "I have no idea."
I couldn't answer because I didn't know what she was saying. So I said, if I said it, it might have been a joke or something. I don't know.
And this was clearly documented in the minutes, that Janette said, if she'd said it, that it may have been some kind of a joke. "Come on, ladies, we're not your slaves, you know." Something, everyday banter. She doesn't know. All she did know is that she believed the managers when they said that they had 2 independent witnesses that had heard her say it, and she was clearly trying to offer some kind of explanation.
When I said it was a joke or something, they said they didn't find it funny. I don't remember saying anything to do with slaves. She said she had witnesses, so I thought I must have said it, but I don't remember. So I said so that she didn't find it funny, even though I don't remember saying it.
They were to take this apology as Janette's confession to the allegation of verbal abuse of residents. And these matters were to escalate even further when placed into the hands of Karen Johnson at the disciplinary meeting.
I was thinking, how would these witnesses had heard me say these things? Then I thought, maybe I'd said it to a workmate. I don't know. I would never say anything like that to a resident, so I said to Karen Johnson. I said it to a workmate.
Karen Johnson, instead of acknowledging the difficulties Janette was having in trying to explain these allegations, was instead to take a different approach. She was now to regard Janette as an unreliable witness who had changed her story.
I wasn't changing my story, I was just trying to explain how witnesses have heard me. I don't even remember saying it. I then said it might have been a slip of the tongue. Then she said I admitted it again. Everything I was saying was just being twisted.
Karen Johnson, assuming Janette's guilt, was then to put the following hypothetical question to her. Karen asked Janette how she would feel if this language had been overheard by a resident in a room. Did she think that this was acceptable? Janette replied no. She was now to reinforce Janette's assumed guilt by putting words into her mouth in the following incriminating way. You acknowledge that when passing comments of this nature, they were in earshot of residents and residents' relatives, which you agreed was unacceptable behaviour.
She said Dad said it in earshot of other people, is what she said, but it's not true. I don't remember saying the word slave. I didn't say anything like that of the kind, is what she said to me.
So from Janette saying if she'd said it, and trying to offer explanations as to how these two independent anonymous witnesses had apparently heard her saying it, we end up with these managers by again persistently refusing Janette's denials, not only claiming that they had multiple confessions from Janette, but that she was also an unreliable witness because she had changed her story. Now we come to the interesting part. Who exactly were these anonymous witnesses? Management had already expressed to Janette their bewilderment, this coincidence that they hadn't put words into their mouths, clearly implying that these were two totally unconnected witnesses, and therefore the allegation must be true. The investigation team concealed from Janette that these were not two independent, separate witnesses at all. They were Mr. Ighodaro and the third person whom Mr. Ighodaro had already confirmed had met up with and previously discussed Janette. These managers, knowing about this previous collusion from the documents withheld from Janette's investigation, knew exactly why they had said exactly the same things in exactly the same way against Janette.
I found out afterwards it wasn't two separate witnesses, it was just Martin again. It was like they were saying it must be true because they had two separate witnesses. She said that it was a bit of a coincidence, so I said sorry. So I thought it must have been true.
How again can this be possibly described as a thorough investigation in order to establish the facts? This was nothing but an interrogation to extract yet another coerced confession from Janette. On the strength of this further coerced confession, Karen Johnson declared Janette guilty of the most serious offence of verbal abuse of the residents that she loved and cared for. There are two further issues currently under legal scrutiny. The first of these concerns another anonymous allegation of racism. When I started to query this anonymous statement, the investigation team were to make the extraordinary claim that the witness statement was taken in the absence of the witness. I was to discover that this totally uninvestigated allegation was put in against Janette anonymously by the investigation team themselves. The second issue concerns the false allegations Mr. Ighodaro made against Janette of widespread bullying, particularly of newcomers, particularly of Filipino workers, where after 8 weeks of investigations, the management were to find just one alleged Filipino victim, Mr. X, the friend of Mr. Ighodaro.